In July of 1944, while Allied armies were still fighting their way through the hedgerows of Normandy and Soviet forces were tearing through Eastern Europe, a very different kind of battle was taking place in a secluded mountain resort in New Hampshire. 730 delegates from 44 nations gathered inside the grand ballroom of the Mount Washington Hotel. Outside, the summer air was calm. Inside, the architects of the post-war world were preparing to redraw the financial map of the planet. Everyone in that room knew the old world was dead. The British Empire, which had dominated global trade and finance for over a century, was effectively bankrupt, surviving entirely on American credit. Europe was reduced to smoking ruins. Asia was ravaged. Factories across the globe had been demolished, rail networks shattered, and national treasuries completely drained. There was only one nation standing untouched, producing half of the entire world's manufactured goods and holding roughly two-thirds of all the monetary gold on Earth, the United States. The delegates were not just there to talk about Reconstruction. They were there to solve a terrifying puzzle that had haunted economists for decades. In the 1930s, the collapse of global trade had triggered the Great Depression, hyperinflation, and mass unemployment, which directly fueled the rise of fascism and World War. When countries ran out of gold, they devalued their currencies to undercut their neighbors, closing their borders and choking off international commerce. If peace was going to last, the world needed a new financial system. It needed a common language for trade. The debate came down to a clash of two minds, representing two radically different visions of the future. In one corner was John Maynard Keynes, the most famous economist of the 20th century, representing Great Britain. Keynes knew his country was fading, but he believed he had the ultimate solution to prevent future wars. He proposed creating a neutral international currency called the Bancor. Under his plan, no single country would control the world's money. A global clearing bank would regulate trade, and nations with massive trade surpluses would be penalized just as heavily as nations with deficits. It was designed to keep any single superpower from holding the rest of the world hostage. In the other corner stood Harry Dexter White, an ambitious and formidable economist from the United States Treasury. White knew something Keynes could not dispute. America held all the cards. The United States had the gold, the factories, the merchant fleet, and the military power. Washington had no intention of handing over control of the global economy to a neutral international committee. White presented a counter-proposal that was deceptively simple. Instead of inventing a new global currency, the world would use something that already existed. Every country would peg the value of their national currency directly to the United States dollar. And the dollar, in turn, would be permanently tied to physical gold at a fixed rate of $35 an ounce. To back this up, the United States made a promise to the world. Any foreign central bank could bring their American dollars to the United States Treasury at any time and exchange them for pure physical gold. It was a promise backed by the impenetrable vaults of Fort Knox. For the shattered nations of Europe and Asia, the offer was impossible to refuse. They needed American steel, American grain, American machinery, and American fuel to rebuild their countries, and America would only accept payment in dollars. To get dollars, they had to export goods to America or borrow from the newly created International Monetary Fund and World Bank. Institutions headquartered in Washington and dominated by American capital. Almost overnight, the United States dollar became as good as gold. In fact, it became better than gold. Shipping tons of heavy gold bars across oceans to settle trade accounts was dangerous and expensive. Transferring paper dollars or clearing them through banks in New York was fast, cheap, and secure. Without firing a single shot, the United States had positioned its own national currency as the indispensable bloodstream of international civilization. For the next 2 decades, the arrangement delivered what looked like an economic miracle. Global trade exploded, Western Europe and Japan rebuilt at unprecedented speed, and the world entered an era of stability known as the Golden Age of capitalism. But beneath the surface of this booming global economy, a fundamental flaw was quietly ticking like a time bomb. It was a paradox first identified by a Belgian economist named Robert Triffin. For the global economy to expand, the world needed more and more dollars to facilitate trade. The only way the United States could supply enough dollars to other countries was by running persistent balance of payments deficits, essentially exporting more paper currency than it took in. But the more dollars America sent abroad, the more foreign claims were created against the gold sitting in Fort Knox. Eventually, the mathematics would break. A day would come when the number of paper dollars circulating around the planet would far exceed the total value of America's gold reserves. By the late 1960s, that exact nightmare arrived. The United States was funding both an expensive domestic welfare program and a costly grinding war in Vietnam. Washington began printing money faster than its gold supply could support. Across the Atlantic, European leaders began to notice the discrepancy. French President Charles de Gaulle was the first to openly rebel. He publicly declared that the dollar's supremacy was an unfair advantage, allowing America to live beyond its means at the expense of other nations. France began loading planes and naval ships with greenbacks, sending them across the ocean to New York, and demanding physical bullion in return. Other European nations quietly followed suit. Gold began draining out of American vaults at an alarming rate. Between 1958 and 1971, America's gold reserves fell by more than half. Foreign central banks held tens of billions of dollars, but the United States only had enough gold left to cover a fraction of them. A catastrophic run on the bank was imminent. If foreign governments all demanded their gold at once, the entire American financial system would implode. On the evening of Sunday, August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon preempted popular television broadcasts to address the American public from Camp David. In a calm, measured voice, Nixon announced that he had directed the Treasury to temporarily suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold. It was the most consequential economic decision of the modern era. With a single speech, Nixon broke the promise made at Bretton Woods. The anchor that had tied global money to a tangible physical asset for centuries was cut overnight. Financial experts around the world predicted disaster. They assumed that without gold backing, the dollar would collapse, foreign nations would abandon it, and the American empire would lose its financial dominance. Yet the exact opposite happened. The global financial infrastructure was already built entirely around the dollar. Oil contracts, shipping lanes, international debt, and central bank reserves were all written in American currency. There was simply no viable alternative ready to take its place. Then came the Masterstroke. In 1974, amid the fallout of the global energy crisis, Washington dispatched high-level diplomats, including Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, to the Middle East. They struck a historic and secretive arrangement with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil exporter. The deal was straightforward. The United States promised to provide Saudi Arabia with advanced military protection, security guarantees, and modern weaponry. In exchange, the Saudi royal family agreed to price and sell all of their oil exclusively in United States dollars. Furthermore, they agreed to reinvest their surplus oil profits back into United States Treasury bonds. Because every industrialized nation on Earth required oil to run its factories, heat its cities, and fuel its transportation, every nation now needed a constant supply of U.S. dollars. If Germany wanted to buy oil from the Middle East, it could not pay in Deutsche Marks. If Japan needed fuel, it could not use yen. They had to first earn or purchase American dollars. The dollar was no longer backed by gold in a vault. It was backed by the lifeblood of the global industrial economy. This transition created what French politicians famously called America's exorbitant privilege. Because the rest of the world must hold dollars to trade and protect their own currencies against financial panics, the United States can print its own currency to purchase real goods, raw materials, and foreign assets. When America runs massive national debts, it borrows in the very currency that it alone has the legal authority to create. When the global financial crisis struck in 2008, originating from within the American housing market itself, conventional wisdom suggested investors would flee the dollar. Instead, in a moment of sheer panic, global capital flooded directly into U.S. Treasury bonds. In times of supreme crisis, the world still viewed the American dollar as the ultimate safe haven. Today, 80 years after delegates gathered in the quiet mountains of New Hampshire, the landscape of global power is shifting once again. Rival powers are trading in local currencies, central banks are buying record amounts of physical gold, and alternative payment systems are being built to bypass American financial jurisdiction. Yet the architecture established at the end of World War II remains remarkably durable. America did not become the world's banker simply by accumulating the most wealth. It did so by designing the rules, building the pipelines, and underwriting the security of global commerce itself. The true foundation of American dominance was never just military force or industrial scale. It was the realization that if you control the currency the world uses to survive, you hold the keys to the kingdom without ever having to conquer it.